Let's speak now to Dr. Thulasizwe Mkhabela, who is a researcher with the African Centre for Food Security at UKZN and Director of Outcome Mapping, who joins us live now. Good evening to you, Dr. Mkhabela, and thank you so much for your time. In 2021, for example, you wrote that to build a resilient and equitable society, South Africa must prioritize not just feeding its people, but nourishing them from before birth with healthy, balanced diets. Let's reflect on a day like today, for example. How much of this would you say has happened, given what we are hearing around the statistics?
Thank you very much. Good morning to you and good morning to your listeners. I think from where I see it, it's a sad day when you look at how much we still behind in terms of making sure that every person everywhere has got access at all times to food, and not just food, but nutritional food that is good for their dietary needs and nutritional needs for a healthy lifestyle. So if you look at the story that you've just been airing, you can see that a number of people will still go hungry. There's hunger and there's malnutrition and there's food insecurity all around us, and particularly for the younger generation, especially children, for the first 1,000 days, which are very important for the formation of a human being.
So one would then ask, is it because food is simply not being produced at a scale that is enough, or are there deeper issues that are going on here?
I think, I know there are deeper structural issues that are at play here. The fact of the matter is that there is enough food in the world to feed everybody. But the biggest problem is access to that food. We know that South Africa, we normally say that South Africa is a nation that is food secure at national level, but food insecure at a household level. That speaks to the issue of saying the food is there somewhere, but not everybody can access it when they need it.
And is it a challenge of infrastructure as well, especially when you look at farmers and possibly the support they receive across the continent?
Infrastructure plays a bigger part to that issue in terms of distributing the food that's being produced by the farmers, because infrastructure also plays a role in the ability of the farmers to produce sufficient food or produce food according to the potential of the land that they are farming. But there is also a bigger issue other than just infrastructure, because even if the food is moved closer to the people, they still have to have enough money to afford that food that is just next door.
Let's look at food production and the challenges, particularly for smallholder and medium-sized farmers. Inclement weather has also become a huge challenge in recent years. How much of an impact has this had as well on the sector?
Climate change has had a big impact on the sector, which then also transcends to just beyond farmers and the income that they lose. Because when there is not enough food that is being produced, or when it becomes too expensive to produce the food, invariably that price increase will be passed on to the consumer, which then makes food less accessible to the majority of people who do not have the wherewithal to actually access that food. So climate change is a big factor that is also contributing towards the worsening food insecurity situation, not just in South Africa, but the world over.
So where do policymakers then focus now in order to try and ensure that they, protect every single stakeholder that's involved here, including the very ordinary citizens?
I think at a policy level, what we should be looking at, particularly in the South African situation, is to make sure that the households that are in the rural areas that have access to land should also be involved in agricultural activities. If you look at what Statistics SA releases every year in terms of how many households are involved in agriculture in the rural areas, the number keeps going down, but then the number of food insecure households is increasing. So there is an inverse correlation between those two, which means that people that have access to land, and especially those that are even unemployed, should be keeping themselves busy, for lack of a better word, with agricultural production to make sure that at least they have food at a household level. And also policy should also focus on making sure that we produce the kind of food that we eat, and also take us back to indigenous foods, or what people call traditional foods that we've neglected, because there is a reason why our forefathers subsisted on that kind of food. And that poses a huge potential for us to pull us out of food insecurity, because most of the traditional foods are climate smart or drought tolerant, so they can survive the vagaries of climate change that we're seeing today.
And you raise such a critical point there, especially because right now you hear of, food that we would have grown up on, for example, being now called a delicacy and simply not being available for the ordinary person, or when it is, some people are then making it so expensive because it is so difficult to access. That, as you say, will deal with two challenges. It will deal with the challenge of nutrition, but it will also deal with what you're raising as well, which would be the issue of ensuring that we deal with the unemployment crisis in the country.
Interesting that you say that, because there's a flip side to that coin. The people that we are saying that we've come from generations that grew up from that food. There is also a stigma attached to that food in urban areas, that when people go back to what we call traditional cuisine or traditional foods, there's a stigma that people think it's a poor man's food, which then is which is also a bit oxymoronic, in the sense that the food is so expensive when you want to buy it, like you said, because it's been made into a delicacy. I think nutritional education is required, which is part of another policy intervention that policymakers should look at, that we should understand the value of the traditional foods and also encourage people to produce that, because it also easily lends itself to be classified as organic, because it's input, it's got low input intensity in terms of production.
And Dr. Mkhabela, as you talk about that, I'm thinking about, sometimes in January when people will have a whole lot of hashtags around cabbage, for example, as they're saying people are poor, they don't have enough money to buy meat this month. So certainly you can make it in different ways. But this is a diet you can even have on any other day if you are educated about nutrition. But how much support is also needed for someone who has land in a rural area to then be able to not only produce it for their family, but as you say, have access to the market, have access to take care of their family, but also have access to make sure that you and I have it as well?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because if you look at this, what we classify as small-scale farmers in the rural areas, those that can produce enough food or more than enough for what they need, they struggle to get to the market, which goes back to the issue of infrastructure that you mentioned, to say that moving your cabbage out of your small plot until it finds the market, it takes a lot of effort on your part, and then it makes the food expensive, and people would rather choose what is mass-produced in large commercial farms around the urban areas where they live. So in terms of doing that, we need to go back and encourage people to grow a diversity of crops, so that we're not all growing cabbages at the same time. Then we end up flooding the market and then killing the price for the cabbages, which is what then serves as a disincentive for farmers to produce that. Because food insecurity is not just limited amount of food that's available, but it's also the dietary diversity. We lack a lot of diversity in our diets. If you look at what you eat on a daily basis, I'm sure you can reduce it to about 6 ingredients that you keep playing around with on a weekly basis. We're not as diverse as we ought to be, given the natural diversity that we have in this country.
And sometimes our children grow up without knowing exactly, that they can diversify their food with some of the indigenous foods. But also, there is the other reality as well, that maybe some provinces may be doing better than the others. Where would you say are the real problems, and which provinces may be doing things better?
I think Limpopo, it comes to mind as a province that is trying its level best to actually make sure that it's producing food for its own, for itself in terms of the provincial agricultural activity. Because even the Stats SA figures show us that Limpopo has got a higher number of households that are involved in agriculture. Limpopo and Mpumalanga, which happen to be neighboring provinces. But other rural provinces like KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape and Northwest are not doing so well. The Northwest you can almost understand, because it's quite a dry province in terms of agricultural activities, hence they end up focusing on livestock. But KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape should actually be doing much better than what they are doing now in terms of producing enough food for themselves. But having said that, people don't have to rely on only what they produce themselves. We are not... these provinces are not countries that there's export and excise that you pay to move things from one province into another. So we should be looking at the comparative and competitive advantages of each province, and those provinces should focus on what they can produce, then they will generate enough money to buy what they cannot produce from the other provinces.
Would you say there's a relation between food insecurity as well as nature? For example, some of the rivers that are not, kept well, would you say there is a link there?
Sorry, you said link between food insecurity
and maybe, like, for example, nature. Some of the rivers, for example, who are not well kept, and that impacts on the issues around water. Would you say there could be links here as well?
There's definitely a link with how we manage the environment. In fact, it goes beyond even just rivers. Simple things that farmers would do. If you put too much inorganic chemicals into your production system, that ends up seeping through to the rivers and the underground water, which then reduces the vitality of that water to actually give us life. But the issue of water is more complex than most people would want to believe, because in terms of the law, for me to be able to irrigate and use river water for my farming activities, I need a water license. And we know that most of these rivers are fully subscribed in terms of the water licenses that they have been issued. So in terms of what water and sanitation on paper look at, is that most of these rivers cannot give any more licenses to people to irrigate.
All right, quite an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Mkhabela. Appreciate it. That was Dr. Thulasizwe Mkhabela there, who's a researcher with the African Center for Food Security at UKZN and Director of Outcome Mapping.